Hello, my name is Brian Karsten, and I am the Winterim and Summer Session Coordinator at Grand Rapids Christian High School. And I'm here to talk to you today about Winterim 2024 and what you and your student needs to know as they prepare to sign up for and then be a part of a Winterim 2024 trip. The first thing that I just want to talk about is our theme verse for Winterim. 1 Peter 4 verse 10 says, God has given each of you a gift from his great variety of spiritual gifts. Use them well to serve one another. And what we believe is that travel is a way to demonstrate those gifts. Some of the gifts especially that maybe don't get seen in other places. Gifts like perseverance and grit, leadership, independence, confidence. In addition to, of course, the gifts that maybe are specific to certain trips. We have discipline-specific trips, such as science trips or language-focused trips. And then, of course, we have service trips where those spiritual gifts get to be put on full display specifically. And so, whenever the Winterim Committee meets, our goal is to look at each of the trips that are proposed by our staff members and to see whether they fit the goals of Winterim as a whole. We look for all of our Winterim classes, trips, opportunities to be a blend of faith formation, something that enhances our school culture, and then, of course, things that have curricular connections. Of course, this is what we hear from our students as well. Here's one from this past Winterim where one of our students responded in our end of Winterim evaluation saying, the things that I experienced and saw were once in a lifetime. I was able to snorkel at a coral reef and see a green sea turtle in the wild. That in itself is incredible. We know our science teachers do an amazing job of trying to create labs and experiences for our students that make science come to life. But when it comes to travel, science truly comes to life as students get to see things that they can only read about in a textbook. Another response from a student says, I grew closer to God and grew closer to people in my grade. We see in this quote our calling, which is to love the Lord our God and love our neighbor as ourself. And so it's exciting to hear these kinds of things from students as they return. And the third and final one, which is really something that gets echoed in so many of our end-of-year evaluations. I really enjoyed the sense of community that was made throughout the whole group, and that it wasn't just a bunch of small groups separately. One of our goals in Winterim is always to keep our trips relatively smaller. We cap the numbers for this reason so that students will feel like they get to know everybody on their trip. And one of the common comments that we hear is that students come back from these travel opportunities feeling like they've made new friends and that the group that they traveled with almost feels like a family. And so those are exciting things to hear, and we anticipate we'll hear more of them after Winterim 2024. And this 2024 slate is an exciting one. We have trips that we are proposing all around the globe. Over the last 12 years of Winterim, we've been to 6 of 7 continents. We have yet to hit Antarctica, although Australia is getting pretty close, and last year Mrs. Camargo ended up in Patagonia as well, so we're getting closer. But this year we've got a big range, and that's one of the goals of our Winterim Committee as well, is to ensure that each year we have a wide range of options, geographically diverse. We try to ensure that we have different price points for our trips, and then we look for different disciplines as well, and so we've tried our best to do that again this year. So let's start talking about those trips and the kinds of things you need to know in order to make them a reality. And the first that parents especially are concerned about is safety and what are the expectations for students when they travel on Winterim. And one of the first questions I would encourage you to think about with your student is whether or not they are ready for Winterim travel. Not every student is ready to travel, and so, that's a family conversation that you may have, but we do want to let you know of a few things here that might make answering that question a little bit easier. The first is that each of our trips are led by GRCHS staff members. One of the requirements for Winterim travel is that a staff member is the proposer of the trip, and so each of the trips has one or two staff members along with it. They, of course, know the classroom, they know how to interact with students, and so that's kind of a good thing that we think helps make things easier. Some of our trips do have additional adult chaperones, and those are chosen by the trip leaders. Sometimes that's based on what's necessary for the discipline that they're covering, or maybe for the personalities on the trip, or maybe they take into account the gender balance of students on the trip to ensure that we've got a good representation. One thing that you can be assured of is that every single one of our trip leaders has passed all of the school required background checks, and so we do our due diligence there. And then we try to ensure that all of our trips have at least a 10-to-1 student to adult ratio. Most of our international trips actually run closer to a 6-to-1 student to adult ratio, and this is what's generally accepted for most of the travel companies that specialize in educational travel, and so that's what we follow as well, and we think it's a good rule of thumb. When it comes to students, there are expectations that we have for our students while they're traveling, because Winterim travel is just an extension of a regular class. And so the first rule is that the GRCHS Code of Conduct applies. And so you know that when students are traveling, they're being held to high standards, the same standards we hold them to when they are in building. In addition to the Code of Conduct, each trip also puts together a trip contract, and those get signed digitally, and I'll talk more about that later. But each trip may have additional expectations for students, whether those are cell phone expectations or other things that may be required depending on the trip and where it's headed and what the discipline is. When students apply for trips, before they even choose a trip, the application to travel, which I'll talk about later, is reviewed by counselors, by our GRCH administration, including Mrs. Hoving, and of course by our central office. And the goal here is to ensure that all of our students are academically, behaviorally, and then that their families are in a good financial standing to travel. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that application in a bit, but again, it's one of those expectations for students. In addition to the fact that students will be expected to bring to their leaders all the necessary travel documents and forms. It says there that these are student responsibility, and I'll mention this a number of times. One of the goals of Winterim travel is to teach that responsibility. We know that travel requires a high level of that, and so when it comes to preparing for the trips, trip leaders are often largely in communication with students when it comes to collecting passports, visas, and notarized letters. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those things when we go forward, and of course our trip leaders will communicate these things with students as they sign up. In order to ensure the safety and the safe travel of all of our students, we do have an insurance policy that we take out for all Winterim travel. This is actually new this year, and I'll talk a bit more about it when we get to trip costs and payments. And then some trips will require vaccinations as well. Now, of course, the COVID vaccination is the one that we all immediately think about, and that one has been largely removed for most travel. I would say all travel, actually. I think only one of our trips requires a test at this point. But there are always vaccinations that may be required for travel, and so individual trip leaders will talk about what their destinations require. Our school policy is that when it comes to vaccinations, we will only require what is necessary for the destination and or the partnering organizations. And so individual trip leaders will communicate those in regards to their specific trips. One thing to consider as you contemplate that opening question, is your student ready for Winterim travel, is the fact that some of our trips, I would say most of our trips, do a lot for some student free time. It is typical to get to a destination, an area, and obviously thinking about safety and what's appropriate, give some students just some time to explore. And so that's something as parents for you to think about, is that something that my student will be able to handle well? Obviously, trip leaders are checking in and giving clear, expectations of when to come back to, meeting places. But there are times when students are just given the ability to roam and maybe check out an area of a city or, a site. And so that's something to contemplate. And then encourage you to just think about the fact that students end up being responsible for email correspondence with leaders as well. This is one of the biggest things that we challenge students to do is if you are prepared to travel, then you should be prepared to be the primary point of contact with your leaders. And so checking your email regularly, being responsive when it comes to deadlines, those are all things that we hope that you'll consider when you start thinking about whether your student is ready for winter travel or not. Another very important factor for families, of course, are trip costs and payments. One of our goals every year is to try to make Winterim travel a possibility for all students. And so I'll talk over the upcoming slides about financial aid, fundraising, and a scholarship opportunity. But the first way that we try to do that is by spreading our trip payments out. This is why this meeting comes in February, is the goal is that when you sign up for a trip this early, we can spread those payments over the course of several months, making things a little bit easier for families. Of course, this is dependent on each trip. Trips obviously cost different amounts, but also different trip companies or the way that they are set up differs from trip to trip. The first thing that is consistent on every trip, however, is a non-refundable down payment that comes with enrollment. We collect 10% up front. Sometimes that's split up between what the school will collect and what a travel company will collect. Other times the school will collect this amount. And that's just to ensure that when a student signs up for a trip, they are invested. And then each trip will have payment options available. Many of our trips work through additional third-party travel companies. And so those companies actually have payment collection. And so trip leaders will walk your student through how to sign up for that and how to set things up so that those payments are made over the upcoming months. But some of our trips are not through travel companies, or maybe they are, but the travel companies don't offer that service. And so what we've done over the last few years is have school collect the payments alongside tuition. And so we use our Smart Tuition software to create a byline that collects money for Winterim travel as well. We have in the past had some families request that their payments not come alongside tuition for a variety of reasons. And so there are ways to make digital payments through the school's website as well. And so the goal is to make paying for your Winterim trip as easy as possible, at least in terms of how that is taken care of. All trips must be paid in full 60 to 35 days before departure. And so we spread those payments out sometimes as early as next month, but all the way through November. And then the last thing that we're really excited about, and I've worked hard at, is trying to find a standard and less expensive Winterim insurance policy. In the past, many of the travel companies that we've worked with have offered insurance policies, and we've actually mandated that families sign up for some level of protection. But those policies have often been more expensive than we've liked and more confusing. They often work with a third party, and so you end up on the phone trying to figure things out with someone who is really difficult to get a hold of. And so we have partnered this year with Barons Hendrick Stite, a local company, and they are putting together an insurance policy that will be the same for every one of our Winterim trips. It's very comparable to many of the policies that we've used in the past, except for now we'll have one set policy and we'll know exactly who to speak to when we have questions. A couple little highlights of that policy, and then you can definitely ask me if you have further questions. The first is that it comes with $3,000 pre-departure insurance. We realize that that doesn't cover the full cost of a trip, but if there were to be a medical emergency or death in the family and a student was unable to travel, which is very rare, it happens once every couple of years, we do have insurance for families to get back up to $3,000 on a trip that they have paid for. Of course, the more common is that, I shouldn't say common, the more important thing that we want to protect against is if there were to be a medical emergency while traveling. And so this policy covers $250,000 in medical in addition to, of course, some trip delay insurance. It will have evacuation insurance and all the things that we come to expect for our Winterim travel insurance policies. I've got lots more information on this. We're excited about it, and we've kind of done our due diligence to make sure it matches much of what we've used in the past. But if you ever had more questions, definitely don't hesitate to email. In addition to spreading our payments out, we also have, and we're always excited to offer, financial aid for many of our travelers. So financial aid is available for Winterim trips. The first form, and I'll talk about this later, that students fill out is an application to travel. Not where they pick a specific trip, but where they just apply to travel. And part of that form is applying for financial aid. And so there will be a place where financial aid is an option that students can apply for. The first thing that I'll mention is that financial aid priority always goes to students that have not used Winterim aid before. Our goal is to try to ensure that students feel that they can travel at least once in their high school career. And so we first allot financial aid to students who are going on their first trip. The way to apply for this is by choosing that option on the form. And I always encourage students, if you're not sure, just click the button. And then, if your family has already applied for tuition aid for the school year, no further action is needed. Mr. Primus has all that he needs. But if your family has not, and I see here that I still haven't fixed that date, but between now and March 1st, your family would need to send their recent tax return to Jim Primus using the byline or the subject line Winterim trip aid, and he would then use that to process whether or not your family is eligible for Winterim financial aid. Winterim aid will be a dollar amount, and the reason we do that is so that you will know your financial aid amount before you choose your trip. And so you will get a set amount, and you can make a trip decision based on the amount that you have been allotted. It's exciting to note that last year, 59 students received financial aid, which made Winterim travel, more of a possibility for them. And so we continue to look forward to ways to support families through this kind of plan. And if you have further questions about it, don't hesitate to email me. In addition to financial aid, we do offer primarily one fundraising opportunity, again, in order to try to make Winterim travel a possibility. And that is through our school's thrift store, New to You. Throughout the summer, New to You offers hourly shifts that students can pick up and go and work. And so they end up paying students. And it ends up being a tax-free payment that gets deposited directly into their Winterim trip accounts. And so it's a great way to raise a little bit of extra money for a Winterim trip. In addition to those hourly shifts, students can sign up for the SHARE program. New to You offers Friday evenings to different clubs and sports teams and then to Winterim, where students and sometimes parents can come and work a 4 to 7 shift. And then New to You offers 10% of the till that evening to all the people who worked that shift. And so this ends up being a very good way to raise some money for Winterim travel. Occasionally other opportunities do arrive. However, I haven't pursued this much because in the past when I have pursued it, students just haven't been excited to take advantage of them. For years we did a Yankee Candle sale and we would get 4 or 5 students sign up. We've tried some other things with limited success, but if they do become available, then I will send those out in the morning announcemements and to students via email. Last year, New to You was our best fundraiser, and over $7,000 was earned by students who were traveling on Winterim through New to You. And then the third thing that I'm excited to talk about today is brand new, and that is a scholarship opportunity for Winterim travelers. We had a very generous donation, which helped set up an endowment for Winterim travel this past year. And so, the Lifelong Explorer Winterim Travel Scholarship is now available, and the Winterim Committee will be able to designate some of these funds to students who are traveling on Winterim. The The writing for the scholarship states that it is for students to experience different cultures, be immersed in exciting new environments, and possibly utilize and grow their fluency in foreign languages, amplifying learning beyond the four walls of a classroom. And so for this reason, not every Winterim trip will necessarily apply for this scholarship. However, most of them do. And the goal is to allow juniors and seniors who have both financial need and who express really great intentions on their application to allot a few of these scholarships to those students. Students that apply and are awarded the scholarship will then automatically be accepted into the trip that the application references. And so students will choose a specific trip and will write about why that specific trip means a lot to them on the application. And then if they are awarded the scholarship, that means they're automatically placed into that trip roster. So that's really exciting if they end up, choosing to follow through with it. A few notes to mention here. The scholarship will not necessarily cover the entire cost of the trip. The goal is to offer a few of these kind of larger scholarships to travelers in order to make Winterim travel a possibility. And we're just excited about this and can't wait to see how this gets used this year. All right, let's get to the timeline. The Winterim travel meeting for parents, that's now. The goal is that you will learn about Winterim travel. You will discuss with your family the different options and pray about which one of these makes the most sense for you and your family. And then, of course, trip leaders are offering focus periods and are always excited to answer emails if you have further questions about individual trips. Following this meeting, students will also be sent an application to travel. Again, that's the one that I'll talk about in a moment, but that one will be due March 1st. And then students who complete that application to travel and are approved for travel will then be sent a trip selection form, and those will be due on March 20th. And I'm going to talk about each of these individually. The first of which is that application process. Again, it says opens tomorrow. By the time you're hearing this, it's probably already open. And it is both in the morning announcements and emailed to all students. It will close at 3 p.m. on March 1st, and it is online only. So it's an online form sent to students. The link is in the morning announcements, as well as it will be on the Winterim website and sent out to students. And just a reminder, this is for general travel readiness, not trip specific. And so students don't select a trip now, they are just applying to travel. It is accessible only through student Gmail accounts. Again, this gets to that Winterim responsibility that we're trying to encourage in our students. And so every year I'll have a few parents email me saying that they're unable to open the form. And my response will be, well, you need to sit down and work with your student on the form because they are the ones that need to be able to open that form. These applications then are reviewed by trip leaders. They're reviewed by administrators and guidance counselors in addition to central office and our dean of students. And then students are decided, it is decided whether or not students are eligible for Winterim travel based on this form. This is also the form where the financial aid and the Lifelong Explorer Scholarship are linked. And so you can choose to apply for one or both of those things there as well. Once those are approved, students are sent an email, and then they are allowed to choose the trip that they are excited about. Often people ask, well, how are students decided? How are trip rosters decided? It is done as fairly as possible. It is based first on seniority and then on a lottery. And so one of the things that I encourage students to do is only select the trips that they would enroll in if selected. They will be able to rank the number of trips that they're excited about up to 5, but they can write down just one trip or maybe 2 trips and only list the number of trips that they would actually enroll in if selected. And then what we do is we first roster all of our future seniors, and then we work through the juniors and then the sophomores. And we do that by drawing names out of a hat and putting those seniors into them according to the drawing. And so the way we do this is try to make it as fair as possible. And so if a trip is filled up with all seniors and we get to the junior class, then we end up drawing the juniors, to go into their second most preferred trip if it still has room, and we kind of work our way down the list. Again, students can list up to 5 trips. Some do, most do fewer than that if there are only 1 or 2 trips they're excited about. And then we create a waiting list from this initial form as well. So there's no separate waiting list. Students will only be put on a waiting list if they are not selected for a trip, and then those students end up being placed into one of their choices if students decide not to travel or if circumstances arise that create openings on a trip. Once students are placed on rosters, their trip leaders will email them a trip contract. And so that contract comes digitally, and what it includes is a request for a bunch of parent information. Again, that's all done digitally, and so this is one of those ones we encourage students to do with their parents. It will prompt a non-refundable deposit, which will be up to 10% of the total. Again, some of our trips will have that kind of split between a travel company and the school, but 10% will be required upon enrollment. And then there will be some trips will have that additional online process if needed. So if it's a trip through Explorica or EF, there may be a separate portal that students need to sign up with as well. And this will be completed by March 29 at 3 p.m. in order to hold that student spot. And if contracts aren't in at that time, that's when we go and look towards the waiting list. So my goal this video was to try to walk through the process a bit. Hopefully I've answered many of the questions you had when you sat down to watch this video, and if not, don't hesitate to email me. I forgot to record the Zoom session, so there's no chat available right now, but some of the questions that came up I tried to answer on this video. Again, don't hesitate to email me with general trip questions, but if you have specific trip questions, you can also email the trip leaders of those trips and they'll be able to help you out. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.